Is Zeidon Alkinani. He's a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University here in Qatar. Good to see you, Zeidon. So we have seen, I think it's fair to say, a kind of frantic 12 hours or so. President Trump claims to have, quote, obliterated military targets on Kharg Island, that's often referred to as Iran's crown jewel. Yet the oil infrastructure on that island apparently remains untouched. How would you describe what's going on here? Is this a shift in US tactics right now?
Yeah, well, it seems like it's turning into an economic war simultaneously to it being a military war. The economic implications and consequences from the conflict for the past almost 2 weeks was indirectly impacted from the war. Now it seems like the economic pressure, the economic target is being strategically put by both sides, openly trying to eliminate one another's influential economic angles in the region, ensuring that it would add further pressure into one of the sides to either calm down or to get on the negotiations table.
So it's fair to say we've shifted from military versus military to infrastructure versus infrastructure. We know that Donald Trump says he reserves the right to potentially destroy those oil facilities on Kharg Island if something doesn't give regarding the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, is raising the stakes the ideal scenario that anybody in the region wants right now?
Of course, it goes really against the recent good news that a lot of regional actors were hoping that they would calm things down. The transformation, the rhetoric from the political leaders involved here, such as Donald Trump, moving from a complete surrender to perhaps accepting some of the nominations and getting into such discussions where perhaps an economic hope that this conflict might end soon, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Most of the sides are still being stubborn. The discourse and the rhetoric is very different on the actions on the ground. But the global economic crisis is perhaps even more severe than what this might translate into the region. The LNG surprise, the energy and the fuel prices across the West, across the world, is heavily being impacted by the economic targets of both infrastructures in this conflict.
If we're talking about a race to escalate here, we've also learned that 2,500 US troops from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Force are on their way from Japan to the Middle East. We presume that they will remain sea-based. What are you interpreting here? Are we looking at potentially a move, or at least the possibility of a move against Kharg Island, the prospect of US forces being on Iranian territory?
It really depends on the developments of the conflict. A lot of tactics are being evolved and changed, as we previously discussed with the recent shift. One cannot deny that Trump is still facing a lot of domestic pressure with the conflict itself, let alone the idea of a ground invasion. Constitutionally speaking, he would need a congressional support for that. However, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution may allow the U.S. president to conduct a military action in an emergency or urgent way based on a belief that there is a threat against their national security from Iran. But does Trump enjoy the privilege or the trust of the American people based on what has been happening for the past few days? It seems like there was a plan A in assassinating the supreme leader and hoping that a Venezuela-Maduro situation would erupt out of Iran. It seems like they lacked a plan B of a clear strategic roadmap. What would have happened and how would they have continued this had the regime continued to resist?
OK, Zeidon, good to hear your thoughts. Zeidon Alkinani of Georgetown University, many thanks. It's being relocated from Japan to the region at the moment. If the intention is to potentially, or at least send the signal that they could put boots on the ground on Iranian sovereign territory, what could possibly be Iran's reaction to that? We have known in the past that when you escalate, the response from this Iranian leadership is to close ranks, to reinforce its rigid ideology.
Well, prior to that, we also have to imagine if Trump will enjoy a political domestic approval to be on the ground. But if we were to look at it strategically, invading a country on its own ground, given that the military strategic aspects will be mostly planned and knowledgeable from the Iranian side. The IRGC has previous experience and former experience in on-ground attacks across the region. It has a proxy network, an array proxy network across the region, which means they have previous experiences in dealing with on-ground military confrontation. The U.S. involvement on the ground, Iran will have to focus on the ground with the boots on the ground, and that will perhaps decrease the attacks that have been happening in the region. It might also be less costly on some of Strait of Hormuz or the other energy and oil fuel-oriented areas and islands and stations around the region, given that it will be a direct confrontation between two different armies. So far, it seems more of a signal, given that politically speaking, it doesn't seem like a objective that might be able to sell into the political discourse, whether it's Trump or Netanyahu, given that there has been a lack of a clear strategic roadmap in this war.
Well, talking about not being able to sell those military objectives, American operation against Kharg Island potentially impact on what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz? Is that what the Americans are hoping, and is it likely to potentially work?
Well, it seems like it's a U.S. response in trying to undermine Iran's economic attempt to use a political and economic leverage through the Strait of Hormuz. It's also a way to witness a multilateral expansion of the Trump or the U.S. strategy in this war, trying to find a different way in pressuring Iran. We've noticed a military U.S. airstrikes. We also noticed attacks on civilian infrastructure, and further political rhetoric and discourse that ensures the U.S. insistence on a regime change or, previously speaking, a complete surrender. That discourse has gradually changed into claiming that they have targeted the main fundamental power structures of the regime, perhaps indicating that they're done with the job in a way that would seem as a symbolic success to them. Now they'll have to deal with the economic consequences regionally and globally. So it seems like we will be witnessing a lot of strategic tactics that are focusing on the money, but not necessarily on the armament.
Right, and talking me in the studio is Al Jazeera's Ressel Surda, who's reported extensively from Iran, and Zeidon Alkinani, a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University here in Qatar. Welcome back, both of you. Zeidon, what do you think the US strategy is when it comes to Kharg Island? Obviously, it means an awful lot to the Iranians. It's their principal oil hub. But at the same time, is the goal to essentially try and hold that island hostage as a means to securing the opening of the Strait of Hormuz? What's going on here?
Well, it is the economic lifeline of the Islamic Republic. Also, the fact that the U.S. hasn't looked at it or considered it in the previous 2 weeks and focused on it now means that they're using or moving to a next stage or a next step into the war, realizing that the military tactics and the strategies against the Iranian regime may have not led to the results that Trump was hoping for or even claimed that he was aiming for. Economically speaking, it wouldn't only be a disaster to Iran, but also to the region and also to the global economy. So, as you mentioned, it's probably a way to hold it hostage, making it an economic and a political leverage that the U.S. can hold against Iran, given Iran's attempt in using the Strait of Hormuz as a political and economic leverage on their side in this conflict.
Yeah, we know we're suggesting that we may well see a tussle for these strategic islands within the Gulf going forward. We've been talking obviously about asymmetric warfare in terms of the Iranians' response. We have also seen Iran escalate horizontally as well by hitting targets across the Gulf. In the last 12 hours, we've seen multiple energy facilities hit, some before the Kharg Island attacks, some afterwards. Do we now expect that war to be widened as well, to see more attacks, more American installations, or any facilities seen to have links to the Americans now being singled on?
Yeah, well, I don't think we needed to wait for this move from the U.S. to even expect such attacks and retaliations from the Iranian side, given if the war and the conflict continues. We've seen the attacks targeting energy facilities, oil facilities, including countries that Iran claims to be under its array of alliances in the region, such as Iraq, which has been attacked by both the U.S. and Iran in this conflict. But given that this move in particular is focusing on the Kharg Island and its oil facility in a much more strategic and open and public way, then Iran may be fully be open about the idea that it will be targeting energy facilities in the region, rather than claiming that it's only targeting U.S. bases and interest in the region, which eventually included energy facilities that belong to the GCC states and not
This is the
US.
eye for an eye doctrine, I guess we've heard mentioned repeatedly by senior Iranian military officials, that if the Americans do this, we will do this in return. Just lastly, Zeidon, on Kharg Island, it is one thing to potentially take that island. It's a very different thing to hold it for a long period of time. Do we expect this to be an exchange of territory as a way out of this conflict, or do we expect this to be potentially a protracted standoff?
I don't think it's either or. I believe Trump would hope not to reach a level where he would attack it, but rather reach a level where he will be able to dominate it and control it. But it also depends on how much he is ready to use it as a political leverage against Iran's attempt to monopolize the Strait of Hormuz and the economic consequences that led to that economically, regionally, and regionally. But given that the military escalations and tensions are only increasing, and it doesn't seem like any of these new strategies would lead to preventing the war from being much more militarized, it seems like it can be under a threat. One cannot deny that the US might view it from an international angle, where that's one of the major supplies the Chinese economy relies on when it deals with Iran, which might indicate another pressure that it's trying to push ahead, given that a lot of the economic assessments also believes that Russia and China might be benefiting from this war indirectly, given the alternative resources it can provide a lot of the European and allies across the world. If we were to imagine EU and the surrounding countries would accept to engage and deal with Russian resources, given that the limitation to that politically is the continuity of the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, the Russians most certainly have found the silver lining in this conflict. Very few silver linings, but Russia most certainly financially benefiting from what's going on. Zeidon Alkinani and Russell Surda.
Close to shore, allowing large tankers to dock. It's also got its own airport to bring in workers and supplies. Well, joining me in the studios is Zeidon Alkinani. He's a Middle East politics lecturer at Georgetown University here in Qatar. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. I want to talk about the importance of Kharg Island. What do you suggest Donald Trump's intentions could be towards the island, given the fact he's made the point that he has ostensibly hit the military installations, but he's not touching the oil installations yet?
It's a next stage development, given that the Kharg island was ignored in the first 2 weeks of the war. It's a recent move that may indicate that there's a shift from the geopolitical to the economic pressure, which might go back to the previous overarching maximum pressure strategy, given the perhaps some of the intentions which we may notice in the transition or the transformation of the discourse and the rhetoric of both Trump and Netanyahu, claiming that there has been some symbolic achievements and successes in decreasing the influence and minimizing the influence of the Islamic regime in Iran as a lead up to rationalizing why they may have decreased the military strikes against the Islamic regime. It may also be a way to further pressure the regime in Iran economically in the lead up to taking a step back geopolitically and militarily, perhaps waiting for the destruction and the dismantling of the Islamic regime in itself. Kharg Island and the oil facilities there is, as we previously discussed, the lifeline of the Iranian economy. In contrast to its GCC neighbors, it's 90% of its oil exports, given that the Kharg Island is where the oil exports of the Iranian economy is centralized, which means it makes it a much more easier of a target by the US and Israel. We also have to relate it to the overarching picture of the economic and the political issues coming from the conversations regarding the Strait of Hormuz, where the US and its allies believes that Iran has been using it or monopolizing it for its own political and economic leverage in this conflict.
Help me out with some context here, because you seem to be suggesting, forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but correct me if I am. You seem to be suggesting that this is another incremental step that the US is taking particularly in order to allow it to be able to back off and say we have leverage with this now. We have leverage in terms of the leadership of Iran. To a certain extent, it would be, is it too optimistic to suggest that this is them essentially trying to work towards an off-ramp, that they are looking for something that they can declare as a victory, that we have they have placed restrictions on Iran itself, and that would give it some degree of control, some degree of leverage when it came to negotiations for getting out of this war and bringing it to an end?
This is if we assume that they will be able to drag the Iranians back to the negotiation island. One cannot deny that Iran has been arguably targeting U.S. interests and bases in the region, but also included civilian infrastructure and resources infrastructure within the GCC. This might even push Iran to further target the energy and oil bases in the region, which it already did prior to this move by the U.S. Now, one could imagine that this is a shift. When we say it's a shift, it's more of a transformation, meaning that the U.S. might want to continue the war geopolitically and militarily, but also add this economic angle into it. One cannot deny that there has been a lot of conversations and discussions about how Russia and China indirectly might be benefiting from this war, as it can provide alternative resources to countries that relied heavily on the energy supplies and resources of this region. China is one of the top traders when it comes to the Kharg Island with Iran. This can impact its economy and also put its economic international trading in a difficult position, balancing the consequences across the spectrum and not having all of the pressure just on the U.S. administration in the lead up to the midterm elections, as it's being questioned domestically about the rationale behind this war.
It is a risky strategy, though, isn't it? Because Iran has already come back and said, no, if you're going to start attacking our oil infrastructure, we're going to do exactly the same, particularly, of course, in the Gulf nations, which have been hit already over the last 14, 15 days.
Absolutely. And it just shows another way of the way the Trump's administration is having a lack of a clear strategic roadmap. In this map, the only strategic or clear strategy that we're witnessing here is the insistence by both Trump and Netanyahu in continuing this war as long as the Iranians are not accepting to getting on the negotiations table based on their conditions, ignoring the consequences and the implications this could translate to the GCC allies of Washington, D.C. A lot of these GCC states have been strategic, economic, and political allies of the United States for decades. The continuity of this war and the ecological and economic and environmental and political and geopolitical consequences regionally, but also internationally, indicates a major red flag and a concerning and an alarming reflection of how the U.S. wants to conduct a interest-oriented unilateral decision when it comes to its foreign policy.
Yeah, we really appreciate you breaking that down for us. Zeidon Alkinani.